Snow fell thick and heavy on the alien market streets, covering the stone ground in a cold white sheet. The air bit like sharp knives, finding its way through every gap in clothing. The people in the market moved quickly, heads down, clutching their goods close. No one wanted to stop. No one wanted to talk. Winter here was cruel, and kindness was rare. In the middle of the crowd, a small figure stood near an empty fruit stall. Her shawl was thin, torn at the edges, and no match for the freezing wind. Her skin had lost its natural glow weeks ago, replaced by a pale, tired color. Hunger had hollowed her cheeks, and her lips were cracked from cold. She had been standing here since sunrise, hoping for someone to notice, hoping for someone to care. Her name was Lyra, though no one here bothered to learn it. To them, she was just another refugee from the war, a burden, a mouth to feed when food was already scarce. She had tried to find work, but no one hired strangers, especially not a young alien woman with nothing to her name. Her last coin had been spent 2 days ago on stale bread. Since then she had eaten nothing. Her body was weak, her mind dizzy, and her hope fading. As the sun sank lower, she knew she could not survive another night like this. There was only one thing left. She could offer herself. The thought made her stomach twist in shame, but hunger was stronger than pride. She had seen others do it, seen the way desperate women traded their dignity for a warm bed or a hot meal. She had promised herself she would never reach that point. But promises meant little when death was close. She scanned the crowd, searching for someone who might accept her offer. Most faces were unfriendly, eyes fixed forward. Then she saw him, a tall human man in a heavy coat, walking with a slow, steady step. His hair was dark, his face partly hidden by the hood of his coat, but his eyes, they were clear and sharp, scanning the market like he was looking for something. Humans were rare in this part of the galaxy. They had a reputation dangerous when angered, stubborn when challenged, yet known for strange acts of mercy. Lyra's heart beat faster. Maybe he would understand her situation. Maybe he would not laugh in her face. She stepped forward, her legs trembling from the cold. The snow crunched under her worn boots. She stopped in front of him, blocking his path. Her voice was quiet, almost lost in the wind. "I have nothing left," she said, her words shaking. "But if you can give me food or shelter, I can. I can be yours." It was the hardest thing she had ever said. For a moment, he said nothing. His gaze lowered to her face, studying her like he was trying to read her whole story in one look. She expected the usual reaction, a smirk, a greedy smile, maybe a hand pulling her closer. But instead, his brow tightened slightly. His eyes softened in a way she did not understand. "You're freezing," he said, his voice calm but firm. She blinked, unsure how to answer. I just need something to eat, and I can," he cut her off, shaking his head. From inside his coat, he pulled out a small cloth bundle and pressed it into her hands. The heat of it shocked her, warmth against her frozen fingers. She opened it slowly, revealing a loaf of bread, golden and soft. Steam rose from it, carrying the smell of fresh grain. "Eat," he said simply. She stared at the bread then. Back at him. "You don't want anything?" His answer was a short shake of the head. "I want you to live, that's all." The words hit her harder than she expected. For weeks, every kindness she had seen had come with a cost. No one gave something for nothing. She didn't know if she could trust him, but the bread in her hands was real. And her stomach ached for it. Slowly, she tore a piece and took a bite. Warmth spread through her body, not just from the food, but from the way he was watching her. Not like an object, not like a transaction, but like she mattered. She swallowed, the lump in her throat making it harder than it should have been. "Why?" she whispered. He shrugged lightly, as if the answer was obvious. "Because someone once did the same for me." Before she could say more, he stepped aside and continued walking, disappearing into the crowd. She stood there, holding the bread, feeling the strange weight of his words. For the first time in weeks, she felt more than hunger. She felt seen, but the market wind reminded her where she was cold, dangerous, and still alone. She didn't know if she would see him again, Yet a part of her hoped she would, because in his eyes, she had seen something she thought the galaxy had lost. True kindness. The bread was still warm in Lyra's hands when the human disappeared into the moving crowd. She stood there in the middle of the market, steam rising from the loaf like a promise she didn't know how to believe. Her fingers tightened around it, afraid that if she loosened her grip even for a second, it would be taken from her, for as long as she could remember. Every kindness she had been offered came with a hidden chain. No one gave without expecting something back. And yet this man had taken her shameful offer, the last thing she could trade, and refused it. The refusal felt like a strange wound, not one of pain, but of something she couldn't name. She told herself it didn't matter. She had food now, enough for one day. Tomorrow would be another fight. But as she turned toward the shadowed alleys, away from the bright stalls, her mind kept replaying his voice. I want you to live. That's all. She sat under a cracked wall, pulling the shawl tighter around her shoulders, and tore into the bread. The heat seeped into her cold belly, spreading like a slow-burning fire. She tried to focus only on eating, but her thoughts kept drifting. Why would a stranger help her like that? Why would a human, of all people, care about a forgotten alien girl in a frozen market? The wind picked up, carrying a sharp edge that cut through her clothing. People hurried past, their faces hidden in scarves and hoods. A group of merchants laughed as they left a tavern, their boots crunching in the snow. None of them even glanced in her direction. That was how it had always been, invisible unless she had something they wanted. But the human had looked straight at her. And in that single moment, she hadn't felt invisible at all. She shook her head, forcing herself to focus. Dreams and questions would not keep her alive. She needed to plan. Night was coming, and the storm clouds overhead promised another cruel freeze. Her spot under the wall would not protect her for long. She stood, tucking the remaining bread into her shawl, and walked toward the quieter end of the market. Where the alleys were narrow and the air carried the smell of old smoke, it was there. She found the abandoned storage shed, its wooden door half broken, its inside dark and empty except for a pile of frozen sacks. She curled up in a corner, trying to make herself small, but the cold sank into her bones no matter how tightly she wrapped herself. Her stomach was no longer empty, yet she could not sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the human's face, the way his brow had drawn slightly when she made her offer. It wasn't disgust she saw there, nor desire. It was something softer, almost like pity, but warmer. She didn't know if she liked that feeling or hated it. The night dragged on. She drifted in and out of shallow sleep, waking each time a gust of wind rattled the broken door. When dawn finally came, pale and thin, she felt heavier than before. The bread was gone, her body still cold, and the market outside was already alive with noise. She stepped into the morning light, her breath a white cloud. The same merchants were back, their voices loud and their hands quick as they set up their stalls. The smell of cooking filled the air, making her mouth water all over again, but the human was nowhere to be seen. She told herself it was better this way. One act of kindness did not mean safety. People changed quickly when they saw an advantage. She had to remember that. Still, her eyes searched the crowd without meaning to, looking for the shape of his hood, the slow stride of his walk, the day passed in the same rhythm as all the others. Hunger, cold, the constant search for something to trade or somewhere to hide. By nightfall, her limbs were aching, her throat dry. She had nothing left again, and the thought of offering herself to someone else made her chest feel tight. That was when she saw him. He was near the far side of the market, speaking to an older vendor. The snow had caught in his dark hair, and his coat looked heavier today. Lyra's feet moved before she could stop them. She stepped into his path again, her heart pounding harder than she liked. I didn't thank you, she said quickly, before her courage faded. He looked at her, those same steady eyes meeting hers. You don't have to.
I do, she
insisted, though. Her voice trembled. But why? Why give me food and nothing else? No one does that. The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, because not everything in life should have a price. The words felt heavier than the winter air. She wanted to believe them, but they clashed with everything she had learned about survival. "I could have worked for it," she said, almost defensive. "I know," he replied, his tone calm. "But I didn't want your work. I wanted you to keep your dignity." She stared at him, unsure whether to feel insulted or grateful. The refusal she had feared, the one that left her with nothing to trade, was somehow more powerful than if he had accepted. As he walked away once more, she realized something. His refusal hadn't just saved her for the night. It had forced her to imagine a different way to survive, one that didn't mean losing herself. And that idea, strange as it was, scared her more than the hunger ever had. The wind began to howl before the sun even touched the horizon. The market thinned quickly as merchants packed away their goods, their faces tight with worry. Winter storms in this region came fast, turning streets into frozen traps. Lyra stood near the edge of the stalls, her shawl pulled tight around her thin frame. The cold had already started to bite at her fingers and toes. She knew she had to find shelter before the storm hit, but the alleys she usually hid in would not be enough tonight. The clouds overhead were thick and heavy, a warning that the wind would turn deadly. She started toward the old storage shed, but the first gust nearly knocked her off her feet. Snowflakes stung her face like tiny blades. Her breath came in sharp bursts, and the frost in the air scraped her lungs. By the time she reached the quieter streets, the world was already fading into white. Her mind screamed at her to keep moving, yet her body felt heavy, her steps slower than they should be. Hunger still lived in her bones, and the cold was pulling her strength away piece by piece. Then, through the blur of snow, she saw a shape. Tall, broad-shouldered, moving against the wind with steady purpose. The hood of his coat was pulled low, but she knew that walk. The human. She almost turned away. Pride told her not to depend on him again. But another gust of wind hit her, and her knees buckled. The ground rushed up, cold and hard. She struggled to stand, but her legs refused. A shadow fell over her, and a gloved hand reached down. "Can you stand?" His voice was calm, steady. Against the roar of the storm, she tried to answer, but her lips were numb. He didn't wait for a reply. Strong arms lifted her as if she weighed nothing. For a heartbeat, she panicked, her hands pressing against his chest, but the warmth of his coat wrapped around her like a shield. "Hold on," he said, and she did. Not out of trust, but because she had no choice. The snow swirled around them in a furious dance as he carried her through winding streets. The sound of the wind filled her ears, but under it she could hear the rhythm of his breathing, calm and unshaken. She kept her eyes closed, too tired to watch the world blur past. When he finally stopped, it was in front of a small wooden cabin. The roof was layered with snow, and a thin curl of smoke rose from its chimney. He kicked the door open with his boot. Stepping inside without ceremony, heat hit her face instantly. The air inside smelled of burning wood and something rich, like cooking meat. The walls glowed faintly from the fire in the hearth. He set her down gently on a sturdy wooden chair near the flames. The sudden warmth made her shiver harder, her body struggling to adjust. "Stay there," he said, hanging his coat on a hook. He moved with quiet efficiency, tossing more wood into the fire before disappearing into a small side room. Lyra looked around. The cabin was simple. A wooden table, a shelf lined with jars, a bed in the far corner, covered with thick blankets. Everything was neat, nothing out of place. When he returned, he held a steaming mug. "Drink," he told her, placing it in her hands. She hesitated, her eyes narrowing slightly. "What is it?" "Herb tea," he answered, his tone patient. "It will warm you." The first sip burned her tongue, but the heat slid down into her chest, chasing away the ice lodged there. She drank again, more eagerly this time. "You could have left me," she said after a while, her voice still weak. "I could have," he agreed, setting a pot over the fire. "But you wouldn't have survived." His blunt honesty left no space for argument. She stared into the flames, the crackle of burning wood filling the silence. "What is this place?" she asked. "My home," he replied, without looking up. "For now, it's your shelter." The words stirred something inside her, relief, but also suspicion. And after the storm, you decide where to go, he said simply. No demand, no bargain, just choice. It unsettled her more than if he had named a price. He ladled stew from the pot into a wooden bowl and set it before her. The scent made her dizzy. With hunger, thick broth, tender vegetables, bits of meat that glistened in the firelight. She picked up the spoon, her hands still shaking, and took a mouthful. Flavor burst across her tongue, rich and warm. It was more than food, it was life returning to her in small, careful pieces. As she ate, she found her eyes drifting to him. He sat across the table, eating quietly, not staring at her, not asking questions. He seemed comfortable in the silence, and somehow, that made her feel safer. Outside, the storm raged harder, battering the walls with wind and snow. Inside, the fire's glow wrapped around them like a quiet promise. For the first time in a long time, Lyra felt like she might make it through the night. But deep inside, a new fear had begun to grow. Not of the storm outside, but of what might happen. If she started to believe this human truly meant his kindness. The fire burned steady through the night, its warm light painting the cabin walls in shades of gold and orange. Outside, the storm howled like a wild beast clawing to get in. But inside, it was calm, almost too calm for Lyra to trust. She sat in the chair nearest the fire, wrapped in a thick wool blanket the human had given her. Every few minutes she would glance at him. He was busy at the small wooden table, sharpening a knife with slow, careful strokes. The sound of steel sliding against stone was steady, almost soothing. "You're quiet," she said at last, breaking the silence. He looked up, his eyes calm. "So are you." "I don't like talking much," she replied, then added, "Not two strangers." "Then we can be quiet together," he said, going back to his work. The answer unsettled her. Most men she had met would have tried to pull words from her, to make her speak, to make her reveal something they could use. But he seemed content to let the silence stay. She shifted under the blanket, unsure if she liked that or not. After a while, the smell of something fresh filled the air. He had moved to the hearth again, tending a small pot. The stew from earlier had been enough to quiet the ache in her stomach. But now the scent made her mouth water again. "What are you making?" she asked. "Bread," he answered. "Better fresh." She frowned. "You gave me bread yesterday." "I did," he said, not looking at her. "But that was travel bread. This is better." His voice was so matter-of-fact that she had no reply. She watched him work the dough with practiced hands, shaping it into a neat round, before placing it near the heat. There was no rush in his movements, no waste, no show. Everything he did seemed purposeful. She found herself asking, "Why do? You live here? Alone?" He paused, glanced at her, then shrugged. "Because I like it that way. That's not an answer. It's the only one I'm giving," he said. His tone even, it wasn't rude, but it was final. She dropped the question, though curiosity still stirred inside her. When the bread was ready, he set it on the table between them. The crust was golden, and steam rose from the soft inside when he broke it open. He passed her a piece without a word. The taste was warm and rich, different from anything she had eaten in months. She chewed slowly, letting it fill her. And for a moment she forgot to be cautious. "You could sell this," she said between bites. "People in the market would pay well for bread like this." "I'm not a merchant," he replied simply. "You could be," she pressed. "I could," he admitted, then looked at her steadily. "But I'd rather feed someone who needs it than sell it to someone who doesn't." She froze at that, the bread halfway to her mouth. There was no trick in his voice, no hint of performance. He said it as though it was the most natural thing in the world. "You're strange," she muttered. "I've been told," he said, almost smiling. The storm outside grew louder, rattling the cabin walls. She pulled the blanket tighter, but her eyes stayed on him. "Why did you help me?" she asked again, softer this time. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, staring into the fire as though it held the words he needed. "Once," he said slowly, "I was the one in the cold. I had nothing, no food, no shelter. Someone saw me, and instead of turning away, they gave me what I needed without asking for anything back. That's how I lived long enough to stand here now." She listened, unsure if she believed it. The galaxy wasn't kind. People didn't just help for no reason. Yet the way he spoke made it sound possible, and now you do the same? She asked. "When I can," he said, his voice steady. "It's the only way I know to pay that debt." Her gaze lowered to the bread in her hands. For weeks, she had been nothing but a trade to others. Her labor, her safety, her body. This was the first time someone had given her something without weighing its worth against what she could give back. It was unsettling, like standing on ground that might shift at any second. When they finished eating, he stood and took her empty plate without asking. He moved around the cabin in quiet efficiency, stacking wood, checking the shutters, cleaning the table. She watched him, noting how his actions were quick but never careless. "You act like someone's coming," she said. "They might," he replied, glancing at the door. "Storms make desperate people." Something in his tone told her he wasn't only talking about thieves or strangers. She didn't ask. By the time he banked the fire for the night, the wind outside had softened to a dull roar. He nodded toward the bed. "You should take it. I'll sleep by the fire." Her eyes widened. "Why?" "You need the rest more than I do." She hesitated, suspicious of the offer, but the exhaustion in her body was stronger than her doubts. The bed was warm from the fire, the blankets thick. As she lay down, she heard the sound of him settling into the chair, the crackle of the fire filling the quiet. In the darkness, she stared at the wooden ceiling, listening to the storm fade. She wanted to believe his way was real, that kindness could exist without cost, but part of her still waited for the moment the price would come due. Morning came slowly after the storm. A pale light seeped through the small window, turning the frost on the glass into a sheet of silver. Lyra woke in the bed, her body warmer than it had been in weeks, yet her mind alert. The cabin was quiet. Except for the faint pop of the fire, the human was already awake, sitting at the table with a small piece of paper and a worn pencil in his hand. He was writing something, the movements of his hands steady, his face unreadable. She sat up, clutching. "The blanket, what are you doing?" "Making a list," he said without looking up. "For what?" "For supplies we'll need before the next storm," he replied, his tone casual. As if the "we" was nothing worth noticing, her chest tightened. "You speak like I'm staying." He glanced at her then, his gaze calm. "You can if you want to." She looked away quickly, her fingers tightening on the blanket. "I told you, I have nothing to give." "I know," he said simply, returning to his writing. The answer frustrated her. "Then why keep helping me? You don't even know me." Set the pencil down and leaned back slightly, his eyes on her now. "'Cause I don't need to know every part of you to see what's in front of me. You're hungry, cold, and alone. I can change that. That's enough reason." She frowned. No one does that without wanting something. A shadow passed over his face. Not anger, but a kind of old memory surfacing. "Someone did it for me," he said quietly. "And they wanted nothing back." She hesitated. "Who?" His eyes drifted to the fire. "A woman on a mining colony. Far from here. I had been working in the deep shafts for weeks, trying to pay for transport off that rock. Cave entrapped a group of us, and by the time we were pulled out, I had nothing left, no money, no strength, nothing but a torn coat. I was ready to lie down and let the cold take me." His voice was steady, but there was something behind it, a weight carried for a long time. "She found me outside the supply station. Gave me her own coat, took me to her home, fed me. I told her I couldn't pay. She said payment wasn't the point." Lyra was silent. She could almost see it, the cold mining colony, the dirt and smoke, the human as worn down as she had been. "What happened to her?" she asked softly. "She didn't live long after that," he said, his gaze fixed on the fire. "The mines were dangerous, the air filled with poison dust. Me time, enough to get off that colony and find my own path. Everything I've done since is because she didn't walk past me when she could have." The cabin was quiet, except for the fire. Lyra felt something strange in her chest. Not quite pity, not quite gratitude, but a mix of both. so you help. Others because she helped you, she said slowly. I help because it's right, he corrected, his voice firm. And because I know what it feels like when no one sees you. She looked down at her hands. Those words hit deep. She had spent so long being invisible. It's passed over unless she offered something someone wanted. But what if you helped the wrong person? She asked. Someone who would hurt you. His mouth curved into a faint smile. Then I'll deal with it. I'd rather take that risk than walk away from someone who truly needs me. She studied him, trying to find the flaw in his words, the hidden motive. But she saw only the steady calm that had been there since the moment he refused her offer. In the market, it made her uneasy. People with power always wanted something, but maybe his power came from not wanting it all. He stood and went to the shelf, pulling down a small jar. Eat, he said, placing a bowl of dried fruit on the table. You'll need your strength. If you want to help me cut more firewood later, she blinked. Help you? You want to give something back, he said, meeting her eyes. This is how you can. It wasn't a command. It wasn't even a bargain. But the thought of being useful without losing herself sent a ripple of warmth through her chest. Later. Outside, the snow crunched under their boots as they worked. The cold still bit at her skin, but it no longer felt like an enemy. He showed her how to hold the axe, how to split the wood cleanly. And for once she didn't feel like a burden. As the sun dipped low, they carried the wood back inside. The cabin filling with the scent of pine. That night, as she sat by the fire with her hands wrapped around another mug of tea, she realized something. His kindness wasn't about pity, and it wasn't about ownership. It was about giving someone a chance to stand again. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, Lyra felt like she might be worth saving. The days after the storm felt different for Lyra. Not easier, the cold still cut deep, and the wind still howled through the mountains, but different. The cabin had become more than just shelter. It was a place where she woke to the smell of bread or stew instead of fear, where her hands held tools instead of being empty, where she could look someone in the eye without lowering her gaze. She found herself learning small things she had never cared about before: how to stack firewood so it burned longer, how to mend torn fabric with steady stitches, how to season food so it tasted richer. These tasks were not grand, yet each one built something inside her that had been broken for years. The human Kale. She had learned his name, never treated her like a guest or a servant. He simply made space for her in his routine, as if she had always been part of it. She chopped wood while he hunted. She mended clothes while he repaired tools. In the evenings, they ate by the fire, sometimes talking, sometimes just sitting in silence while the flames danced between them. At first, she had thought the silence was awkward, but over time she began to like it. Silence meant safety. It meant no threats, no bargaining, no demands. One morning, Kale left early to gather supplies from the market, leaving her with a simple list of chores. Lyra spent the day cleaning the cabin, brushing snow off the roof, and tending the small herb garden he kept near the wall. She was kneeling by the plants when she heard voices in the distance. 2 traders were walking past on the snow-covered path. They didn't see her, but their words carried on the wind. They say there's a human living out here, taking in strays, one of them said. Foolish thing to do. The other replied, you can't trust desperate mouths. Sooner or later, they'll turn. Lyra froze, her hands tightening around the basket she carried. It's worse, the first trader continued. There's a price on his head, some bounty from way back. He crossed someone powerful. The voices faded as they moved down the path, but the words clung to her like ice. A price on his head. She didn't know if it was true, yet it lodged in her mind, heavy and sharp. When Kale returned later, she tried to read his face, to see if he looked like a man hiding from something. But he was the same, calm, steady, his coat dusted with snow. He handed her a bag of grain and a small jar of honey, and for a while she said nothing. That night, as they sat by the fire, she asked, why did you come to live here? He glanced at her. I told you I like it here. That's not the whole truth. He studied her for a moment, then leaned back in his chair. No, it's not. She waited, but he didn't offer more. People talk, she said quietly. They say there's a bounty on you. The flames cracked, filling the pause. His gaze didn't waver. And if there is, then they might come for you, she replied. His voice stayed calm. They might. It was infuriating how he could speak of danger as if it were a passing cloud. You're not worried? She pressed. He shook his head. I've lived with worse. If someone comes, I'll handle it. She wanted to demand answers, but part of her understood. He had given her space without questions. Maybe he expected the same in return. The next morning, they returned to the market together. For the first time, Lyra walked through the stalls, not as a beggar, but beside someone who treated her as an equal. People noticed. Some gave her curious looks. Others whispered. She caught fragments, that's her. He took her in. Poor thing, but she kept her head high. They traded for flour, dried fish, and a bundle of candles. When one merchant tried to overcharge, Cale's steady stare made the man lower the price without argument. Lyra realized that, for all his quiet ways, Cale carried a kind of strength that needed no shouting. On the way back, the wind carried the sharp smell of snow again. Another storm was coming. Cale adjusted the load on his shoulder and said, "We'll need more wood stacked before nightfall." They worked side by side until their muscles ached, the sound of the axe splitting wood echoing through the frozen air. By the time the sun dipped low, the cabin's walls were lined with neat piles. Inside, they warmed their hands by the fire. Lyra sipped tea, watching the snow start to fall again. "You could have left me in the market that day," she said quietly. "I could have," Cale agreed, "but you didn't." His eyes met hers, steady and warm. "Because you needed someone to remind you you're worth more than what you thought you had to offer." Her throat tightened. She looked away, but the words sank deep. For so long, she had lived only to survive. Now, for the first time, she was living for something else. The storm that night was fierce, rattling the cabin walls and howling through the trees like some wild creature. Lyra sat close to the fire, the blanket wrapped around her shoulders, listening to the wind. Cale was by the door, checking the latch. Again, his expression calm as always. But something in her chest was not calm. She kept thinking of the trader's words, of the bounty, of the danger that might follow him here. If someone came for him, it would not be just his fight. She would be caught in it too. The thought should have made her afraid, yet fear was not the strongest feeling in her. For weeks, Cale had been giving her food, shelter, and a place to breathe without cost. But he had given her something else, something far more dangerous. The belief that she mattered. She had once been ready to sell herself just to survive. Now she was ready to stand beside someone, even if it meant risking the life she had just begun to rebuild. Near midnight, the sound of the wind was broken by another sound, the crunch of heavy boots on snow. Lyra's head snapped toward the door. Cale had heard it too. He moved silently, lifting the old rifle from its place by the wall. Through the small, frost-covered window, Lyra saw them. 3 figures moving through the snow, hoods low, hands near their belts. It's the way they moved told her enough. These were not travelers seeking shelter? Cale's voice was quiet but firm. "Stay back," she shook her head. "I'm not hiding." "This isn't your fight," he said, his eyes still on the window. "It is if they're here because of me," she replied. For a moment, his gaze flicked to hers. Something unspoken passing between them. Then he gave a short nod. The knock on the door was hard, sharp, the kind that wasn't asking permission. Cale opened it just enough to stand in the doorway, his voice calm. "What do you want?" The man in front smiled thinly. "You, Cale. Orders say you come with us. Alive is optional." "I'm not going anywhere," Cale said, his tone steady. The man's eyes narrowed. "Then you'll freeze where you stand." Lyra's grip tightened on the small hatchet she had taken from the woodpile. She stepped into view beside Cale. "If you try," she said, her voice cold, "you'll have to get through me first." The leader looked at her, surprised, then laughed. "You think you can stop us?" "No," she said, raising the hatchet. "But I can make you wish you hadn't tried." Something shifted then. The men had expected a lone human, not someone willing to stand beside him. The hesitation was brief, but Cale moved in that moment. The next few seconds blurred. Kale striking first, the doorway exploding into motion, the sound of fists and boots in the snow. Lyra moved too, swinging the hatchet when one of them tried to push past. She felt the jolt in her arms when it hit, the shock of someone stumbling back. When it was over, two of the men were retreating into the dark, dragging the third between them. Kale stood in the doorway, breathing hard but steady, the rifle still in his hands. Lyra's heart was pounding, but she didn't lower the hatchet until Kale gently took it from her. "It's done," he said. She looked at him, the firelight catching the frost in his hair. "They'll come again." "Maybe," he said, his voice calm, "but next time we'll be ready." "We." The word stayed with her as they closed the door and barred it against the cold. Later by the fire, Kale poured her a cup of tea. "You didn't have to stand with me," he said. "Yes, I did," she replied. "You gave me a life worth protecting. I'm not going to let anyone take it away." For a long moment, he said nothing, just looked at her with that steady gaze she had come to know. Then quietly, "You've changed." She thought about it. "I think I just remembered who I used to be before hunger took it away." The wind outside began to fade, replaced by the steady crackle of the fire. In the quiet, Lyra realized something. She was no longer living from one meal to the next. She had a place, a purpose, and someone who believed in her without asking for anything in return. It was more than survival, and she would fight to keep it.